Yo, welcome back. How's it going? Still feel a little bit broken from last week's Shane meeting, and I am certainly very grateful for the therapeutic staff that have been running these Shane groups for the last 2.5 weeks. I know that the further we go down, the deeper we get, the more emotions come out, the more we become physically exhausted. And so I know that this community at the moment, as well as the counselors, are running on empty. But we are almost finished. Tomorrow is our final wrap-up day. And I think it has been a very successful couple of weeks from a therapeutic perspective. So I'm hopeful that we will see some of the results of this work in a couple of weeks. It normally takes a while for it to settle in. What I can say very confidently is that this community has blown us away with their willingness to go into the deepest crevices of their existence and to really talk about the real stuff that's going on, not just the surface level things. And to be honest, that fills me with so much hope and joy that the therapeutic community can be working at this level within group therapy. And I'm sure you guys as supporters and even the recovering addicts can understand just how difficult that is, and more importantly, just how important that is to show a dedication to the recovery that they're really fighting hard to achieve. I will say this, hearing some of the stories, that many of us, I don't think, quite comprehend the depth of each and everyone's shame. And I do think that shame topic that we spoke about last week was really important to try and wrap our heads around as individuals, so that we don't allow this shame to continue to dictate our lives. So this week's topic is on forgiveness. We are heading into that topic for the residents. In fact, on Thursday we're actually heading into a leadership equipping conference. So we're going to be starting to work in this area, so I thought it's just good that we do a little bit of presentation on forgiveness so that we can continue following this recovery process. And I'd love to next week or so, the following week, is to just put together all these topics we've had over the last couple of months and just knit them all in nicely so that we can see the bigger picture of recovery and addiction and understanding what life looks like in addiction. I know we did a topic on freedom and joy a couple of weeks ago, and I think this topic of forgiveness is going to start to tie into that premise in itself. So I think for us to be getting to a place of unpacking forgiveness, we've got to understand the resentments and unresolved hidden angers that sit in beneath all of our existence. Often our resentment and anger is masking our internal shame. We really need to grip the fact that anger and resentment are actually power emotions that we display and experience and hold on to in times when we feel most powerless. And so when we look at those things of anger and resentment towards situations and people and events that took place in our life, what we'll find underneath all of that is it actually created or highlighted a sense of powerlessness in us. And when we start talking about that word powerlessness and us not having any control or power, you start to feel a little bit inadequate and insecure. And one can see how the shame-based identity underneath that feeling of powerlessness can really drive this projected secondary emotion of anger and resentment. I think many of you, specifically the supporters, would really have experienced from the addict's perspective the rage, the anger, the resentments, the blame, the victim mentality, all of these power emotions that are actually just concealing the reality of their powerlessness. Deep down, they don't necessarily believe it all, but it is a defense mechanism that allows them to feel in control and powerful rather than out of control and powerless. It also covers and masks their serious shame and feelings of inadequacies and responsibilities, etc. I think as much as I understand resentments from a addiction recovery perspective, and as much as I understand resentments being the fuel to pretty much every single addiction, I think from a supporter's perspective, there is always an ability to interlink into the understanding of carrying your own resentments and unresolved anger. So when we go back to our own childhood, when we go back to our feelings towards our siblings, when we go back to our feelings towards an ex or our ex-husbands and wives or partners, when we look at our current loved one who's an addict and we look at all the people we blame for that, there's bound to be a hidden layer of resentment and anger. It's not to say that we experience anger and rage and resentment all the time, but it's to say that we can identify that in certain situations we often get triggered, and when we're triggered, that resentment and that anger boils over to unhealthy levels. It really creates a response in us that we know within ourselves is not healthy. And so we place an enormous amount of attention towards the end of treatment on really looking at the residents' anger, unresolved anger and resentments in every single one of their relationships, because there's a lot going on there. And we generally look at them from the perspective of being the victim. Why we do that is because the balancing act of that is really in the relationship side of things, where we take on the perspective of perpetrator. And what we find at the core of every one of these resentments, 90% of these resentments, the ones where we weren't actually the proper victim, is that somewhere early on we abdicated responsibility. Somewhere early on we could have taken a decision that would have changed the outcome. Somewhere we decided to allow this resentment to be the justifications for some of the decisions that we've taken. And what we're going to find at the root of many of these resentments is an underlying fear. If I had to take action the way I should have, what was the fear that limited me doing that? We find shame and fear at the root of all of our reactions to these people and situations that have resulted in underlying resentments. And we talk a lot about building these narratives. Like, we have different storylines that fit our narrative, that fit the way we feel, that fit the way we perceive things. But these narratives may not necessarily be built on truth. And if we're quite honest, many of our resentments we've carried around for decades, and we've allowed those resentments to really develop us into a certain character or certain persona. So we look at some of those romantic relationships that we're now real resentful towards our partner, and we ask ourselves, well, how come this relationship went on for so long? Why was I scared of letting it go? Why was I scared of being alone? Why was I scared of not getting out in time? In fact, we go a little bit deeper. What was my motives and intentions for getting into the relationship in the first place? Did it make me feel special? Did it make me be seen? Did it give me some kind of financial worth or resources? Was it something that I was trying to fix somebody again? Was my worth built up in this individual and them changing for me so that I could feel more loved? The other ones that come quite a lot, I suppose, for the supporters are the people-pleasing tendencies, the desperate attempts to be liked and needed, and at the end of our people-pleasing escapades, we often just feel used and abused, and relationships break down and things get complicated, and we can develop and hold anger and resentment because we feel people used and abused us or took advantage of our good nature. We can really look at the end of the story that validates why we have the right to be angry, but we never really look at the side of the story of why we were people-pleasing in the first place. Why were we not able to say no in the first place? Why were we saying yes when we should have said no? What was going on within us that we needed something and we were unable to do what we know was probably the right thing to do? Now, a lot of people, specifically supporters and even recovering addicts, we pick up all the responsibility that everyone around us seems to drop. We maintain control, we keep the status quo, we catch everybody's dropped catches, we really run around trying to make sure that everything stays together, that all the plans are in place, that everybody has what they need, and we feel or believe that we're doing that out of the goodness of our own hearts, and we're doing that for the benefit of everybody else around us. But if we're honest, do it for years, do it for a decade, do it for somebody all the time, we get resentful because nobody wants to do it for us. We get resentful because nobody wants to see how much we do. We get resentful because everybody just expects us to do these things. And often that always leads us to a point of feeling like, nobody cares, nobody loves us, and I develop this power emotion of anger and resentment towards the people, because what I'm not seeing underneath is the powerlessness to say no, is the need to be in control, is the need to be liked, the need to be needed, etc., etc. So yeah, we've really got to layer and go through each one of the layers. And why I bring this resentment thing up as a kind of next extract of shame is we've got to go through a process of getting to a point of forgiving the people we resent. And the one way we do the forgiving is by examining the resentment and seeing what exactly we are responsible for. We've got to get to a point of being able to forgive these people. We have to get to a point of understanding the actions or lack of actions that took the situation to where it was. We have to look at what we can take responsibility for, understand that we also had choices, and understand if we had made choices that we could have had a different outcome. And we really, really have to start to let go and forgive all of these individuals that we hold great resentment towards. The addict needs to do it. The addict has loads of narratives and justifications for why mom and dad were to blame and why they were too strict, and that's why I had to lie all the time and couldn't be honest and open, and there was too much discipline which made me fearful, and they never came to my sports games, so I never felt love. Whatever. They have narratives upon narratives of resentments and disappointment and victim modes that somehow in their mind justify their behaviors and their choices, and somehow in their minds validate and excuse all the consequences, and somehow in their minds justify why they need to lie and not tell the truth, and so on and so on. It is such a web of totally flawed perceptions. And yeah, we undo that web during treatment quite well, but I do think the supporters benefit from really looking at these things. We've got to forgive the people in our past that we hold resentments towards by taking ownership and responsibility. A touchy point for supporters is the resentment that we hold towards our loved one. Specifically a child or a partner, it's very difficult to resent the addict It's not an easy emotion to talk about. It's not an easy emotion to claim. It's not an easy thing to live with. The addict has broken all their promises. They've stolen, they've lied, they've manipulated, they've pretended to offer hope, they've stolen hope away, they've done all sorts of things that have given you more than enough ammunition to hold grudges and resentments towards. And I know sometimes we speak, you can resent the addiction and not the person you love, but there's a reality that says I have a right, and it's healthy for me to be angry towards this person. And 100%, I'm not disagreeing with your right to be angry. I'm saying don't let that anger develop into resentment, and don't let it go unchecked, and work towards a place of forgiveness. And again, if we follow this train of thought for all the resentments that we've held towards all the people throughout our life, and if we look at each resentment and track it down to a point where we could have changed the outcome, I think if we're honest with ourselves as supporters, we could come to understanding some truths that perhaps we refused to see the signs that were right in front of us. Perhaps we chose to give benefit of the doubt because we didn't want the disappointment or the chaos. Perhaps we didn't want to confront the truth sitting right in front of us because we just didn't want to know the answers. Perhaps we've always enabled and allowed the person to get away with murder because it just makes us feel better. Perhaps deep down we've resented all of the people around the addict's life that we've blamed for this person's addiction. Like we've got to get to that inner core of ourselves, past the resentments, into the shame, into self-reflection, and then into a part of saying, right, I've got to start forgiving these people. What you find through that process of unpacking all of those external resentments and coming to a place of accepting responsibility in most of them is that we actually develop a large self-resentment. We actually develop a large focus on anger towards self. How did I let this happen? How come this always continues? Why do I make the same stupid mistakes? Why am I always reacting like this? Why am I always choosing these relationships? You get to a point where we're actually developing a resentment on self. And that resentment on self, in most people, becomes a healthier way of dealing with it than resenting hundreds of people just because I don't want to feel powerless. And so when I resent self, I can really start to work on forgiving self. I can really start to work on letting go of the blame, letting go of the justifications, letting go of the anger, letting go of all of the control, and really start to say, let me have a look at the choices and actions that I've taken in my life. Let me get a fresh perspective on why I keep doing the same things over and over and over again. And we can then work towards forgiving self. This is not about condemning self. This is about forgiving self. We go to forgive other people and we go to forgive self. And it's this process of forgiving others and forgiving self that leads us into that freedom and joy in recovery. It leads us into freedom and joy in who we are. It stops us from ignoring the deep-rooted shame and history that really kind of make us who we are. We can't live in freedom and joy when we're not living in forgiveness. We can't live in freedom and joy when we're crippled by shame. Like, we can only start to experience true freedom and joy, true recovery, when we start to let go, forgive others and self. And so I'm going to finish this video off with one extra layer, the spiritual layer, the spiritual principles, the foundations of we need to forgive and then we can be forgiven. We need to stop judging and then we won't be judged. We need to stop condemning and then we won't be condemned. Like, we need to start to look at these spiritual principles. When we look at that, I think I said in the last week, our shame started in Genesis, where we hid from God. Our shame separates us from God. Our shame makes us detached. Our resentments make us angry at God. Our self-resentment makes us unworthy of God. When we kind of put all these conditions together, when we put these levels of control and shame and resentment and anger and lack of forgiveness and self-hatred and lack of worth, like what we've created is an individual that is separated from God. And we teach this a lot. If we can't forgive others and if we can't forgive self, how do we live in the forgiveness of God? How do we live in the sacrifice of Jesus? And many of us that have been stuck in the chaos and the crisis and the journey of life where things haven't gone our way and the addiction and the survival, many of us that have been stuck in that have come to a point of not feeling worthy of forgiveness, of feeling like we have to work for forgiveness. It's something that cripples us, like we live that shame, because if we're not worthy of forgiveness, then who are we? We live in that shame and resentment because we constantly have to work towards something that is quite freely given to us. So yeah, we have to start with forgiving others. We have to start with forgiving self, and then we have to start with accepting forgiveness from others. And yeah, I think from a supporter perspective, you might have forgiven your loved one, and that's perfectly fine. The question I have is, has your loved one accepted that forgiveness? Perhaps from a supporter perspective, we're expecting our loved one to work for forgiveness, to prove they're worthy of forgiveness, which is not necessarily healthy. It's not a healthy perspective. And perhaps if we're really honest with ourselves, those that have Christian values and beliefs and relationships with God, like, how worthy do we feel of God's forgiveness? How worthy do we feel of Jesus' sacrifice? Or are we living in a state of resenting and blaming God? Are we living in a state of, why me, Lord? Are we living in a state of, shame and difficulty in just being honest and open with God and with Jesus, and with understanding that He's ultimately one in control? We are ultimately going to always fall short. We are always going to be sinners. We are always going to have things that we can be ashamed of, yet we live in a constant state of grace and forgiveness, both the addict and the supporter. And when we can accept that, we will find freedom, we will find joy, we will find peace. And so I think hopefully this video has given you a bit of an understanding of the golden thread of treatment, understanding of why exposing shame is important, why dealing with resentments that cover shame is important, why forgiveness and letting go is important, why accepting forgiveness from God is important, why this entire journey is taking us to a point of experiencing that freedom and joy and peace. But it starts with being honest about our condition, about ourselves, and about the way we view people. So see you all on Thursday. I'll be at the leadership camp, so we'll be zooming live from Marujembe, from the campsite, and we will probably have some wonderful praise and worship going in the background, and we can continue to unpack this topic of forgiveness. Thursdays, 7, Zoom. See you all there. Enjoy your week.